All right, welcome everyone. We'll wait just a moment, let everyone find their seats, and we'll get started. All right, well, let's go ahead and kick things off. We have a lot of content to get through. We've got about 90 minutes to do it. Welcome back for the third part of our AASHTO Bike Guide webinar series, put together by PBIC and sponsored by FHWA and helped greatly by Tool Design. You're going to be hearing from several panelists today who will be leading us through the final installment of the guide, and then we'll have some discussion to answer the questions that you have, things that you're wondering about in the context of this material, and then queuing up some future episodes, deep dive sessions that I'll talk about in just a moment. But let me first introduce our panel for today. We're welcoming back Jeremy Charzan, who is an owner at Tool Design in Silver Spring, Maryland, where he leads the company's multimodal design practice. He is a licensed engineer in 14 states and has been practicing engineering for over 26 years. In addition to designing many miles of roadways and bikeways, he served as an author for various design guides and research, including the fifth edition of the AASHTO Bike Guide, as well as the Ohio Multimodal Design Guide and various NCHRP reports. So we're delighted to have Jeremy back with us. And we're also welcoming back Hannah Pritchard of Minnesota DOT. Hannah is the pedestrian and bicycle engineer with the Minnesota DOT and also the current chair of the AASHTO Technical Committee responsible for the development of the bike manual. We're also welcoming back Charlotte Claybrook, who is the active transportation programs manager for the Washington State Department of Transportation. Charlotte was the chair of the NCHRP committee for the AASHTO Bike Guide update and served on the AASHTO Technical Committee on Non-Motorized Transportation throughout the time period for which the updated bike guide was conceived and developed and published. So we're delighted to have them here with us. Jeremy will present a lot of the remaining content, and then we'll bring everyone back together for the discussion period at the end. I just wanted to give you a lay of the land in terms of where we are in this series. If you've been with us the whole time, we're glad you're back. We have held two initial episodes, one on the evolution of bike infrastructure and an overview of the AASHTO Bike Guide. And then last time we got into a lot of detail about design principles of high comfort bikeways, showing some examples and recommendations from the guide. Today we're wrapping up our discussion with talking about just some additional advances in design. We're going to cover topics like shared lanes, bike lanes, and traffic signals, bicycle facilities and strategies for safety, ramps, and alternative design, bikeways and wayfinding systems, general design principles for structures, and then wrapping up with some discussion about maintenance, parking, and end-of-trip facilities. So there's a lot of topics that we've covered over this three-part series. If you are not seeing the topic you're interested in mentioned in this episode, there's a good chance we covered it in previous episodes. So in a moment, I'll show you where you can find the recordings for those. It's all free and available to look back. We are going to be putting together some deep dive sessions to follow this series, and those are going to be intended to address specific topics that, based on your feedback and your questions, we didn't really have a lot of time in the series to grapple with. So we want those to be based on what you all want to see. And for that reason, I'd encourage you at any time to please send in questions, comments through the chat, and also to respond to the post-webinar questionnaire where you'll have an opportunity to share what other topics or what topics would you like to hear more about. And so we will be keeping you all informed as we schedule those. Hopefully within a few months, we'll get some of those on the books and invite you all back to take part in those discussions. A bit of housekeeping. I won't go through all of this because I've mentioned some of it already, but we are archiving the webinar, recording it. The slides are posted. I'll send links to all that very shortly. You can submit questions anytime. We've got about half an hour at the end where we're just going to be responding to those and having a little bit of discussion. You can look forward to a follow-up email from me tomorrow that will include all this information and more, so you'll know exactly where to find it. And that's all I'll say for now. Please keep those questions coming in if you have them, but I'm going to turn things over to Jeremy to start jumping into our part 3 final episode content.
All right. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us for part 3 of the series. For those of you who have been along for the whole journey here, thanks for coming back. Just as a quick refresher on the structure of the guide and where we're going to pick up. So in webinar 1, we covered chapters 1 through 4. Webinar 2 covered chapters 5 through 8. So today we'll walk through the remaining chapters 9 through 16 and give you some of the insights behind each of those chapters. I will note that 9 through 9 through 16, many of those are new chapters. So 10 through 14 were all new chapters. So hopefully some new and exciting content for you all to digest and apply to your project. So with that, let's dive right in. So chapter 9 deals with the design of both shared lanes and then more conventional bicycle lanes. So right off the bat, at the beginning of this section, we highlight some shortcomings of some of the past design guidance on these topics, and sort of while past design documents have provided recommendations that 14-foot wide outside lanes can accommodate people biking and people driving, what what we've learned from various research and people's experiences is that that's really not an effective strategy at accommodating the needs of people biking. That when we provide 14-foot lanes, they tend to encourage higher vehicle speeds, which when crashes occur, they result in more severe crashes, and that providing those wider outside lanes doesn't actually provide enough width for both users to use that space and pass one another within the lane. And that was some of the past perception that if you provide a wide outside lane, then that's enough width for everybody. But in reality, in order for motorists to properly pass a bicyclist, even in a 14-foot wide lane, they would need to at least partially change lanes in order to provide that 3 or 4 feet of additional passing space. So really not an effective strategy. So the guidance that you'll find in section 9.3.2 really encourages the use of narrower travel lanes when shared lane conditions are being used, encourages the placement of shared lane markings in the center of lanes where appropriate, and sort of trying to create designs that discourage drivers from trying to quickly overtake bicyclists within the same lane, and sort of reinforcing through the widths available that in order to pass a bicyclist, you have to change lanes in order to do that, even if that means crossing a double yellow line on a 2-lane road. And legally that is something that is permitted, and now the designs will sort of further reinforce that strategy. Um, so when we are providing wider travel lanes, like what's shown on the left here, it sort of reinforces that when placing shared lane markings, they should be placed more towards the center of those lanes. Again, the 14 to 17-foot wide travel lanes is not something that's typical or encouraged, but it's just something to be aware of. And then in situations where we're providing less than 14-foot lanes, it's more important to be placing those shared lane markings in the center of the lane, particularly where we have on-street parking, as that placement will ensure that the shared lane marking is placed outside of the door zone and better encouraging bicyclists to ride outside of that door zone from and shying away from parked vehicles. Um, Similar to what you'd find in the previous editions of the bike guide, and similar to some of our past discussions, the widths of the bike lanes identified in this edition of the AASHTO bike guide differ based on what is located along those bike lanes. So when you are adjacent to parked vehicles or adjacent to a curb, those widths are different than if you're adjacent to just a exposed edge of pavement. And again, this is sort of built off that idea that we want to, through design, provide the widths needed to provide the appropriate shy spaces from vertical objects that bicyclists will naturally shy away from. Again, similar to some of the other facility types that we've talked about in the previous webinar series, the recommendation of the guide is to select values within the recommended range. So we provide that recommended lower and upper limit while also giving you the flexibility in the most constrained conditions to go as far down as the practical minimum. Again, reinforcing though that when we select values in that practical minimum or less than the recommended values, that begins to diminish the bicyclist's comfort and safety. So, referring back to what we said in chapter 1, the use of these words of practical minimum and the use of designs that leverage those do have trade-offs associated with them. Um, this is also a chapter where we talk about the design of buffered bike lanes and the different types of buffers that should be provided. And so essentially, if you have a buffer that's less than 2 feet wide, it's essentially not practical to spend the time and effort trying to paint a tiny little gore marking in that space. And so the guidance is to omit those gore markings and just rely on the two lines. You can also provide that as a single wider line. So using a 12 or 18-inch white line instead of two parallel lines is an option that you have available to you. Then when we're between 2 and 4 feet of buffer space, your sort of single gore marking is the preferred approach. And then once we begin to exceed 4 feet, using the more chevron style marking is what's appropriate. I'll note that the MUTCD allows you to use either the diagonal gore or chevron if the buffer is at least 2 feet wide. AASHTO kind of aligns with that guidance, but is a little more prescriptive when we're talking about those widths greater than 4 feet wide. So just something to be aware of in the nuance and slight differences between the AASHTO guide and what you'll find in the MUTCD. We also give a reasonable discussion of designing adjacent to on-street parking, and that we want designers to be aware that door zone conflicts present a real safety issue that should be considered as part of our design process. So in developing the recommendations for the bike guide, we noted that studies have shown that a door zone bike lane is marginally better than a shared lane environment. So that is why we do provide designs for the quote unquote door zone bike lane, but recognize that it's a very similar performance between a door zone bike lane and a shared lane. Um, where space is available, the guide recommends providing a door zone buffer to encourage bicyclists to shy away from that on-street parking. It does have some discussion of looking at things like parking turnover and a recognition that if parking turnover is extremely low, that it might be one of those situations where we want to place the buffer between the bike lane and the adjacent general purpose travel lane. But being aware of those different trade-offs and the options that we have available to us is really what this part of the chapter was trying to drive home. In the most constrained conventional bike lane designs that are adjacent to on-street parking, we note guidance that's shown here on the right side of this slide that you can consider marking that bike lane in the door zone, and you can consider installing optional door zone markings, and that's what those partially hatched lines are adjacent to the rightmost edge line of that bike lane is some markings to encourage bicyclists to shy away from those on-street parking. Um, I will note that I have seen very few implementations of these markings. I know I have a photo of one installation somewhere, and I was looking around for it before the webinar and actually couldn't find it, nor can I remember where I saw this. So if you have some of these installations, feel free to drop those locations in the chat because it is sort of one of those unconventional designs that really hasn't been implemented in a lot of locations. In this chapter, we also discuss the experimental treatment of advisory bike lanes. So within the guidance, we note that advisory bike lanes can be considered on roadways that are less than 25 miles an hour. That's sort of the preferable, but allowances for up to that 35-mile-an-hour max mark. Generally encouraged on roadways with lower traffic volumes. So again, 3,000 preferable, less than 6,000 max. And in this chapter, we also discussed that you need to be thinking about sight distances, given that depending on the configuration of your advisory bike lane, um, motorists may need to encroach into the bicycle space in order to allow the users to pass one another. So ensuring that there's adequate sight lines is going to be really important. I'll note that these traffic speeds and traffic volumes aren't binding. So because this is an experimental treatment, you do have the option of considering these treatments in other conditions, and that would be part of your application to federal highway as part of your request to experiment. I know that there are certainly countries and locations that have explored the use of these types of treatments in roadways that would exceed these thresholds. So because it's an experimental treatment, it is one of those things that we're still sort of trying to figure out what the most appropriate contexts for installation actually are. Um, we do discuss the two different sort of types of advisory bike lanes and that there's, just some variation in the approach to the use of space. So in the version depicted in the middle of the slide or on the left of these two options, that's where the central travel lane area is really only wide enough to accommodate one motor vehicle of width. So really visually communicating that in order for two drivers to pass one another, they need to encroach into the bicycle space. The version on the right is where the width is technically wide enough to accommodate the widths of two normal sized vehicles, though in practice, the drivers will still likely shy into the adjacent edge lane road or advisory bike lane. Um, while this is an experimental treatment, I'll note that these do have a crash modification factor listed in the CMF clearinghouse. You can find that under the title Edge Lane Roads. And in that resource, these types of treatments are shown to reduce crashes. And it appears like part of the reasons for this is it requires motorists to operate their vehicles a little more carefully. It does provide dedicated space for bicyclists, so further helps to reduce things like rear end bicycle crashes. And then additionally, motorists are located further from the edge of the roadway. So particularly in sort of more rural contexts or locations like that where run off the road crashes are prevalent, the fact that the motor vehicles are sort of more centered in the roadway is probably resulting in fewer of those run off the road type crashes. We also discussed the design of counterflow bike lanes or contraflow, if if you prefer that term. Counterflow is what we used in the guide. These are particularly useful on one-way roads where we can sort of concentrate bicycle traffic in both directions and sort of provide two-way operations, even though the regular design of the road is really for one-way operations. When designing contraflow or counterflow bike lanes, we do need to be thinking about how that movement is being accommodated at intersections. So particularly in a retrofit type installation where the existing roadway network was one way, there's often not going to be things like traffic signals in that counterflow direction. So the need to add signal equipment or direct bicyclists to follow pedestrian signals if they're visible from that counterflow lane. All of those things need to be considered as part of the design. But really, these should be considered in places where it's providing sort of more direct access for bicyclists and not sending them out of their way to connect to another facility, and also where there are key destinations along those routes. This chapter also discusses the design of conventional bike lanes at intersections and driveways, and depicts various solutions that you have available to you at intersections, but also illustrates that you can always convert a conventional or buffered bike lane to a protected intersection or separated bike lane as you approach these conflict areas. So that's what's illustrated in the image on the right here. We have conventional bike lanes on the approach, but are transitioning to a protected intersection. I'll further reinforce that the research identified in NCHRP 1125 recommends a protected intersection design over things like mixing zones and pocket bike lanes. And that's not just for separated bike lanes, it's really for all bike lane infrastructure. So something that we should be considering as part of our design. But we give you a lot of other illustrations of how to deal with conventional bike lanes and buffered bike lanes in situations where we have dedicated right turn lanes. Um, so illustrated on the left is where we don't have enough width to maintain that bike lane and instead need to rely on more of a shared lane environment. So in that situation, you have your dedicated right turn lane and the use of shared lane markings within that right turn lane. The option in the middle is where we do have enough width to accommodate both the bike lane and the right turn lane. And here we're actually showing it with the striped buffer of the buffered bike lane being maintained through that location. I'll also draw to your attention the note listed in that buffer at the intersection itself, that it says buffer with divisional island or delineator is preferred, and that essentially what we're trying to say is you can include flex posts in that buffer, and that would be preferred because what it does is force drivers who are entering that right turn lane to enter in the merge area that you've provided and forces them to enter that at a slightly slower speed. Those of you who have sat at intersections doing traffic counts and other activities over the life of your career have probably seen multiple times that drivers without those flex posts are more likely to simply veer across the striping and enter that right turn lane using more area than just the merge area itself. And so that option of providing some verticality in the buffer helps to better control the motorist operation at those locations. And then on the right, we're showing that you do have options of keeping the bike lane to the right of the right turn lane if you use signalization to phase separate them. So that might be preferred in situations where you have extremely high volumes, or like what's depicted here, where you actually have dual right turn lanes. It's essential that you phase separate in those situations. Um, and the other thing I wanted to highlight is keeping the length of these auxiliary lanes as short as is absolutely necessary. It's something that's said in each one of those figures and discussed in the text, that we want to keep them as short as possible and keep that merge area as close to the intersection as is reasonably possible. The reason for that being, motorists will begin to slow as they approach the intersection, so the closer we can get that merge area to the intersection, the more likely it is that drivers will be traveling at a slower speed, meaning any conflicts are occurring at that lower speed. Another unique design is the one depicted on the right. This recognition that in situations where we have exceedingly long right turn lanes, providing a pocket bike lane for multiple hundreds of feet is not going to be an uncomfortable way for a bicyclist to navigate, given that they're traveling between both the right and through traffic for very long distances. So you do have the option of continuing that bike lane to the right of the right turn lane, and then as you get closer to the intersection, creating a merge or mixing area before you transition the bicyclist to the left side of the right turn lane. And also just as a reminder, anytime where we have any of these lane drop scenarios at auxiliary lanes, we can't mark the continuation of the bike lane through those mixing areas and instead have to rely on shared lane markings in those types of situations. Next up is Chapter 10, which deals with traffic signals and pedestrian hybrid beacons. Right off the bat, I want to reinforce what the MUTCD and AASHTO is trying to point you to. This recognition that while there are traffic signal warrants, we also have flexibility to rely on an engineering study to justify the installation of a traffic signal. We also know that as our networks are being built out, we likely don't have bicycle volumes that are existing that we can rely on, and instead have to rely on anticipated volumes. The last thing here is a reminder that bikes can be counted as either vehicles or pedestrians when considering things like warrants. So particularly in situations where we have bike boulevards and we're also providing some traffic control to allow both bikes and pedestrians to cross at those locations, we can evaluate using the pedestrian warrant, combining the volumes of bicyclists and pedestrians. But even if we don't meet those warrants, what the text of the guide tries to reinforce is that if we are designating something as a bicycle boulevard, a low stress road that meets the needs of people of all ages and abilities, if we bring you up to a challenging roadway to cross and do not have sufficient infrastructure to cross that safely, then it likely will not be a heavily used bicycle boulevard because it's the intersections themselves would not meet the needs of people of all ages and abilities. So it's often necessary to provide some level of additional traffic control at those challenging locations in order for the routes to work safely and comfortably. We also give some discussion on setting traffic signal progression speeds and this idea of the green wave, where the signals are timed at speeds that are closer to bicyclist speeds. This not only gives better progression for bicyclists that are traveling continually along those routes, but motorists also tend to learn that if they travel at a lower speed, they will also benefit from those green waves. And so signing what the progression speeds are set for can be one of those traffic calming and operational benefits on signalized corridors. We give a lot of discussion in this chapter on the various ways of providing signalized control devices for bicyclists and a recognition that we have the flexibility to have bicyclists follow the pedestrian signal, to follow conventional signal heads, or dedicated bicycle signals. Another thing that I wanted to mention here is some text in the guidance that speaks to the idea of using bikes may use pedestrian signal signs instead of bikes use pedestrian signal signs. Um, and this is not a standard MUTCD sign, so just be aware of that. It might need to be a text-only sign in order to meet that criteria. But I wanted to flag why this might be appropriate, and it's because if you sign that bikes use pedestrian signal signs, then legally they're required to use that signal, and bicyclists that have to follow that signal legally aren't allowed to enter the intersection during the flashing don't walk. So giving them the option of using it to get the benefit of things like a leading pedestrian interval while also following the adjacent motor vehicle signal until it goes yellow is a strategy to sort of maximize the time that bicyclists can use to navigate an intersection. This is also the chapter where we discuss the placement and size of signal heads and this idea of both near side and far side signals, and on the near side, we have the option of using smaller signal heads. That is something that the 11th edition of the MUTCD does permit. Um, and also being clear that when anytime we are providing signal heads that bicyclists need to follow, that those signal heads need to fall within their field of vision or their cone of vision. So if you're telling a bicyclist that they need to follow the pedestrian signal, then the placement of that pedestrian signal needs to be visible not just to the pedestrian, but also the bicyclist on the approach and on the at the intersection itself, so that they know when their signal is telling them to proceed. Like I said, you are allowed to use the smaller 4-inch signal heads, and when you do that, it's best to locate them right at the stop bar so that a bicyclist that's waiting has a clear line of sight. This is an example from Portland that also includes a wait timer so that bicyclists at that location know how long it'll be before they get the green. I will note that that is an experimental treatment, so it would require a request to experiment with Federal Highway if you were trying to incorporate those weight countdown timers. There are a lot of different signal phasing strategies that we can use when dealing with the design of signalized intersections. And those signal phasing strategies range from providing concurrent movements with other users all the way up to full protection and then everywhere in between. So we talk about um, the trade-offs and the design configurations of each of those, that we can have everybody get green at the same time and progress, and that will have permissive conflicts between things like turning motor vehicles and through bicyclists, and then the use of bicycle leading intervals, so giving the bicyclists that are already at the stop bar that head start to get into the intersection before you allow motor vehicles to proceed. And then the two strategies of full separation, one would be giving the bikes a green indication and holding turning traffic so that we have a fully protected phase for those through bicyclists, or providing what you would consider a bicycle scramble or a bicycle only phase where bikes are able to proceed and all other users are stopped in those situations. So we discuss each of those. There's a lot of additional graphics in the guide to discuss each one of those strategies. So an important topic to dig into and really understand. We also discuss the um, situations where you would very much want to provide protected phasing for bicyclists based on what they will encounter at those intersections. So we discussed the traffic volume thresholds where separation is important. Now, to be clear, these are not warrants, they are just recommendations, but they are based on the volume of turning vehicles and sort of the complexity of the intersection. So for example, in the upper left quadrant of this chart, it's saying that if you have a one-way bikeway, that could be a conventional, a buffered, or a separated bike lane, that you should consider phase separating them from right turning traffic if those right turns exceed 150 vehicles per hour, or for left turns that are only turning across one lane of approaching traffic if those volumes exceed 100 vehicles per hour. By comparison, the bottom right of that table is saying that you have a two-way bikeway on the right side of the road. That could be a separated bike lane or a shared use path, and that you should consider phase separating those users if the rights exceed 100 vehicles per hour, but because the lefts are turning across two lanes of approaching traffic, we're saying that you should always consider phase separation. And again, this is about the complexity of the intersection. So in that situation, your left turning motorist is very much focusing on finding gaps in the two approaching lanes of traffic, and not as likely to be looking and focusing on bikes that are coming in each direction, and particularly coming up from behind them or traveling in the same direction of them. And that's why we're saying in all situations that have left turning motorists going across two or more lanes of traffic, you should consider phase separating them. Again, pointing to some external resources that have been published since the publication of the AASHTO guide. And CHRP 1125 gives a little more guidance on this, specifically for right turns. And all of these recommendations were based on a variety of different research, field research, simulator, and a review of past crashes. So here we're getting a little more granular and giving you some recommendations where allowing concurrent movements can be considered versus a leading interval versus full separation of that movement. But again, this is only looking at right turning conflicts, not left turning conflicts. And then also in this chapter, we have discussions of green and red times and how those can relate to um, bicyclists navigating a signalized intersection. So in situations where you're only giving minimum green time on an intersection approach, what often would happen if you're designing just for motor vehicles is that the bicyclist will barely even get into the intersection before it begins to turn yellow. So the calculation here that's recommended is where we have bicycle traffic that is trying to get across these intersections and we're trying to provide a minimum amount of green time, that green time should be based on that bicyclist's startup speed and characteristics. So um, allowing them to at least get to the middle of the intersection before you then begin to change to yellow. Similar challenge with red clearance time, that a bicyclist is going to be traveling slower than motor vehicles. And so giving a little additional red clearance time means that they can get further through the intersection before you give the cross traffic their green indication. So in this case, it's based on a slower moving bicyclist being able to get across that intersection before you give green. And then how bicyclists are detected also needs to be carefully considered in our signalized intersection designs. Signal loops is a common approach for detecting bicyclists. The guide highlights the quadrupole loop is best at detecting bicyclists. The Q loop shown in the upper left, that's good at detecting bicyclists that are directly above the loop, but the D loop shown in the bottom left kind of has a magnetic field that occurs everywhere within that loop. So it's a little better at detecting bikes that are positioned anywhere within that area. That specific loop type is also apparently better at rejecting vehicles that are in the adjacent lane. So that means that you can set the sensitivity of that loop a little bit higher and ensure that you're detecting bicycles that have a little less metal in their frames. Um, we also highlight where these detection areas should be presented, and that is going to depend on the configuration that you have and whether you have two-stage turn boxes or conventional bike boxes, things of that nature, that if we are using detection as a way to trigger those signals, that we need to place detection in all of those areas. You also have the ability to use other tools, things like video detection. I personally have had good luck being detected by intersections that have video detection, but there are challenges that you can encounter, places that have poor street lighting or commonly have fog or snow as a situation. Issues of glare are also common challenges for video detection. And then there are a number of other strategies like the use of modern cameras that are discussed in the guide. If you are using bicycle detection, the guide discusses the use of markings to communicate to bicyclists where to wait to trigger those signals. What's shown on the right is what was included in the AASHTO bike guide, but what the 11th edition of the MUTCD shows is what's shown there on the right side of the screen, that you have to use the bicycle symbol instead of the helmeted bicycle, and then the wait here for green is the optional treatment that you can include. There is some discussion as well on the use of bicycle push buttons. These are a little more rare, and part of the challenge is you don't want to rely on push buttons for bicyclists because the placement of those push buttons needs to be so close to the edge of the road in order for them to activate it. But there certainly are situations in the medians of crossings where you're trying to give a space for bicyclists to activate those, like rapid flashing beacons or pedestrian hybrid beacons, a need for them to hit those buttons. So we do discuss the placement of them and those considerations, but again, just sort of remember that this is kind of a rare treatment. While this is the last slide I have in the signal section, I did want to mention that there's a lot of other good content in that chapter, things like the design of toucan crossings and other unique signalization strategies that can be used, particularly for things like bike boulevards and places where signalized bike crossings might help to address safety and comfort. So refer back to that chapter for some other treatments that you might want to explore. Chapter 11 covers interchanges, alternative intersections, as well as roundabouts. So in this chapter, we kind of highlight that there are some challenges to the way on and off ramps at interchanges have historically been built, that a lot of them use sort of really flat angles, those 30-degree angles that are sort of prioritizing higher speed vehicular merges and movements that really don't encourage motorists to slow or yield to crossing bicyclists and pedestrians, and that having more of a perpendicular or closer to perpendicular angle is really preferred at these locations. Not only is it preferred for bicyclist and pedestrian safety, but it can also help the motorists see approaching vehicles and not have to sort of turn their head to look behind them for that approaching traffic. But we also know that many interchanges have been built using those flatter angles, and that short of doing a larger capital improvement project, these will often be modified as part of retrofits or quick build type installations. But even at ramps that have that sort of flatter geometry, we can still consider things like signs, markings, and mountable areas to better address bicyclist safety and change a little bit of the way motorists navigate these types of locations. A few things of note here. The graphic on the left clearly shows the green markings being aligned with the path of those entering motor vehicles. Again, this is beneficial to further improve the visibility of those markings. The version on the right, by comparison, has the bikes crossing at more of a right angle to that off ramp. So you're reducing the crossing distance and making that conflict area as short as possible, also sort of consolidating the crossing closer to where pedestrians are crossing so that motorists are kind of encountering those two types of active transportation users in about the same place. Another thing to note is because of the challenges of some of the existing geometry in a retrofit type situation, or in situations where we're trying to accommodate the needs of people of all ages and abilities, there's going to be a preferred design of allowing bikes to exit to the adjacent sidewalk or shared use path so that they can navigate the crossing of these ramps at the pedestrian crossing, which tends to be that shorter crossing. So if we look at the example on the right, you know, most interested but concerned bicyclists are not going to feel comfortable riding through that long pocket bike lane adjacent to a higher speed entrance ramp to a freeway or an intersecting roadway. And so they're going to feel a lot more comfortable exiting to that side street. What we illustrate there on the left is where we have that opportunity to change the geometry of ramps. Creating more of that protected intersection geometry is going to go a long way to encouraging motorists to yield to crossing users and improving the safety and comfort of those crossing locations. Another challenge with interchanges is locations where we have complex merging and weaving that occurs. And I'm sure you can imagine most interested but concerned bicyclists are not going to feel comfortable trying to navigate that in the marked bike lane. That essentially this is a place where motorists are too focused on finding gaps in traffic and either accelerating or decelerating depending on where they're coming to and from. So you certainly still can mark the bike lanes in these configurations, and that might be used by the most risk tolerant bicyclists that are using these facilities. But again, giving that option to exit to an adjacent shared use path should really be considered in these types of complex environments. And then interchanges and some of these alternative intersections like divergent diamonds are places that typically have over or underpasses, and bicyclists might be positioned in different locations, like in the center median and a diverging diamond. So what the guidance really tries to stress here is to really think about the design of these types of locations and the infrastructure associated with it. And certainly not as an afterthought, sort of having the roadway designer coordinate closely with the structural designers to ensure that things like operating and shy space are accounted for when designing the placement of columns and retaining walls and other barriers. And in the case of the diverging diamond, where bicyclists and pedestrians are often funneled into the center median area, recognizing that that's a more challenging location. And so providing enough width for them to have offsets from adjacent traffic, preferably not including them between two concrete barriers with minimal buffer. And again, part of this is just that that's a really inhospitable condition. If you're behind two directions of traffic, often higher volumes of traffic, that's where you're going to be exposed to the most pollution and noise, and just creates a lot more challenges for navigating those space. So what the guidance is really suggesting is that you consider what the user's experience will be when you're developing these types of designs. This is also where we have further discussion on the design of channelized right turn lanes or slip lanes, and that both the AASHTO bike guide and the AASHTO pedestrian guides both discourage the use of high-speed channelized right turn lanes, that these are places where conflicts with bicyclists, pedestrians, and even intersecting motor vehicles tends to be challenging with these types of designs. Again, sort of reinforcing that those flatter approaches, like the one shown on the left, really don't encourage motorists to slow and yield, and that they also provide those poor sight lines for the intersecting motorists. So what the guide encourages is those lower approach angles between 90 and 125 degrees to both improve sight lines and encourage motorists to slow at those conflicts. And then finally, there's quite a discussion about the design of bicyclists at roundabouts. And again, the guide reinforces that you can divert bicyclists on the approach to a roundabout and have them divert onto a side path. The guidance reinforces what you'll find in the MUTCD, that conventional and buffered bike lanes are not permitted to be installed in the circulating roadway. However, separated bike lanes can. Another thing that I wanted to flag here, so the graphic on the right is what it was illustrated, showing separated bike lanes continuing around the circulating portion of a roadway. But what that graphic is showing is where the bicyclists cross the adjacent roadway. This is depicting them crossing in a shared space with pedestrians. That's certainly something that can be considered, but you also have the option of providing both separate bike and pedestrian crossings, and sort of continuing that separation for the bicyclists at each leg of the intersection. That essentially we couldn't depict all the possible scenarios when developing the guide, but recognizing that I know people flip through the guide look at the figures and think that that's what they're supposed to install. So that's why I wanted to reinforce that you can have the separate bike crossing and the adjacent pedestrian crossing in that configuration. The next chapter, chapter 12, deals with rural roadways. We talked about this in one of the earlier chapters that typically the design user in the rural context is the highly confident bicyclist, and that as you then start to approach the more developed areas, that's where designing for the interested but concerned user as our default user is generally the approach, but also recognizing that if you do have key destinations, community destinations along a rural road, something like a school, a community center, things of that nature, even along a rural road that doesn't have a lot of density, that you still can consider the interested but concerned bicyclist as your design user, in which case things like shared use paths may be more appropriate. But by and large, in the rural context, the use of shoulders is what the guide recommends, and that the widths of those shoulders are sort of contingent on what the roadway volumes and speeds are. Again, sort of what we've seen in past chapters on bikeway selection. Also wanted to highlight that the guide really reinforces that when we get to intersections and conflict areas, that we need to be thinking about where the bicyclists are going to be positioned to navigate those locations. So in situations where we are having bikes ride in the shoulder area, when we approach a location where we're trying to provide, say, uh, a turning area and a bypass lane, you don't want that through vehicle, that bypassing vehicle, to pull into the shoulder where bikes are also using those locations. So what's depicted in that rightmost graphic is showing the bicycle shoulder, or sorry, the shoulder converting to a dedicated bike lane adjacent to that bypass lane, so that they do have a dedicated space to navigate through these complex locations. In terms of the widths of the shoulder, the chart on the previous slide identified the preferred widths of shoulders based on speed and volume. Um, this like digs into the nuance of that and gives you a recommended range based on ADT and volume, as well as that flexibility for practical minimum and practical maximums. Again, one thing to note about practical minimum, 2 foot through 5 foot is what's shown here as the practical minimum. So particularly that 2 foot width, that's not wide enough for a bicyclist to fully ride within the shoulder, but still can provide a little bit of space to allow them to ride more comfortably kind of on the white edge line, and providing a little more paved space for all the roadway users to navigate those roads. One thing to note in this table is that it's clear that it's the paved shoulder width exclusive of rumble strips. So because bicyclists can't easily traverse rumble strips, the functional width of the shoulder needs to be the area that is devoid of those rumble strips. And so we do have some illustrations of what that looks like. In our ideal situation, we're placing those rumbles on the white edge line and maximizing the usable width of the shoulder. But in our most constrained conditions, it might be more appropriate to place those rumble strips a little to the right of the white edge line and maximize the space of the shoulder for bicyclists to actually use it. That essentially, in that most constrained environment, if you were to put the rumble strips on the white edge line, it would essentially make the shoulder unusable for bicyclists, and that they would have to ride in the shared general purpose lane. In the upper right, also reinforcing that when we do have rumble strips and a usable functional shoulder, that we still need to provide gaps in those rumble strips to allow bicyclists that see obstructions or debris in the shoulder to give them time to get out of the shoulder and enter the general purpose lane, or for situations where they need to change lanes to make a turn at an intersection. This is also the chapter where you'll find a discussion of advisory shoulders. sort of similar to advisory bike lanes, but in the rural context, the advisory shoulders are also likely to be used by pedestrians as well as bicyclists. Generally the same thresholds and design considerations, but just a slight nuance between the advisory bike lane and the advisory shoulder. Again, if you are considering these, they are experimental and would require a request to experiment from Federal Highway. Chapter 13 digs into the design of structures. Um, we tried to stress pretty hard in this chapter that we recognize that the installation of structures is an expensive endeavor, and that anytime we are replacing an existing bridge, that's essentially going to represent a once in 100-year opportunity to assess whether infrastructure for people walking and biking should be considered. Um, so even on things like long highway bridges over waterways, if those are being replaced, that's our opportunity to assess if there is a benefit to adding additional space for active transportation users. That essentially, if we kick that can down the road, replace the bridge with just motor vehicle space, it's going to be exceedingly expensive to build a standalone bridge in the future that just accommodates bikes and pedestrians crossing at those locations. By comparison, adding an additional 12 foot of width to a highway bridge, yes, it will still be more expensive than without it, but there's some significant cost savings to doing that work rather than building a separate structure. So anytime we're doing these bridge replacements, we want to think about what will our bicycle and trail networks look like in 100 years and try and design with that in mind. We also provide some important discussion, and we've sort of touched on it throughout some of these webinars, is this consideration of the functional space on these structures, and that we need to consider not just the usable width, but also the shy distances from vertical objects, the railings and lights and things of that nature, to ensure that we're maintaining continuous functional widths both on and off of the bridges. I'd further highlight that providing a little additional width on structures also has some benefits when it comes to things like personal safety. Things like lighting and ensuring that we have clear lines of sight also help with personal safety, but having a little bit more room to maneuver and not be in close proximity to other users is going to provide some of that personal safety benefit. Also in this chapter, we do have discussions of things like expansion joints and transitions, as well as a discussion of the design of runnels on stairs. We're just not going to focus on some of those design details today. Chapter 14 covers wayfinding systems. So a lot of this mirrors what you'll find in the MUTCD. The guidance in AASHTO very much aligns with what the MUTCD allows, but really just tries to drive home the importance of providing wayfinding. Not only does that provide benefits for bicyclists, but also for other users. A system of wayfinding can be implemented at the city, the county, the regional, or the state level, and the guide discusses each of those. Um, it also touches on things like national park signage, and then digs into the MUTCD D series and MUTCD community wayfinding signage series, as well as natural routes, state routes, and local routes. Um, it sort of lumps wayfinding into three different categories: advanced turn signing, so wayfinding that tells you before you get to the decision, that gives you a little bit of time to decide, is this a place where you want to be turning? wayfinding signage located at the junction itself so that you know that you're turning at the right place, and then confirmation signs that occur after the turn so that you know that you've actually turned onto the right street or path. This chapter is also where you're going to find a discussion of wayfinding for bicycle detours. So things like through or around work zones are also discussed in this chapter. Chapter 15 discusses maintenance. And we sort of tried to discuss all the aspects of maintenance that we could, sort of driving home the importance of routine maintenance so that if we're strategically doing that maintenance early on, it will further prolong the life of that facility and protect the initial investment that we spent to build it. It also discusses how do we prioritize what routes are important for maintenance and sort of highlights at a high level things like considering bicycle volumes, proximity to key destinations, places where this is really the only viable bike route, and that if we don't maintain this, we're not providing bike infrastructure, and places where we have additional challenges, things like steep grades or reduced widths. If we're not maintaining those facilities, it can create more challenging situations for a bicyclist to navigate. In this chapter, we also discuss that the equipment that we're using to maintain a facility is going to be important to consider, not only for things like loading conditions on a shared use path, but also considering things like the width of this equipment and will it fit within the facility type that we're trying to maintain. And that could be particularly important for things like one-way separated bike lanes, where smaller equipment might need to either be acquired or repurposed from our arsenal of maintenance equipment that we're using to be able to maintain some of these narrow facility types. I'll also note that this chapter does discuss the maintenance of traffic signal equipment and why that's important if we're providing signal equipment for people walking and biking, that needs to be properly maintained so that those safety elements are being constantly available for users. And then the last chapter of the guide is bicycle parking, bike share, and end of trip facilities. And sort of at a high level, it talks about the types of bike racks that should be considered, that largely that's U racks and post and ring racks. And the reason being that those two types of racks provide 2 points of contact between the bicycle and the rack itself. Other racks like wave racks and school racks really don't provide that 2 points of contact, or if they do provide it, it would only be provided if you're parking your bike incorrectly on those racks. So really the U rack and the post and ring are the most functional for different bikes of different sizes, and sort of maximizing the usable space of the bike parking. Here we also highlight the importance of thinking about longer bikes, things like cargo bikes, and how those are going to be accommodated. Also, this is going to relate to not blocking pedestrian routes. So you might recall from our first webinar that we talked about that um, you can't have anything blocking a pedestrian access route, but you can place things like bike racks in the adjacent frontage zones and street buffers. Um, that's sort of reinforced in this chapter of the guide. And then we also tried to drive home thinking about where you're placing these bike racks, that if we can provide them in a place like what's shown in the upper left there, placing the bike parking in line with on-street parking, then that means that bicyclists don't need to enter the pedestrian realm in order to access that bike parking. Also, little details matter. So in that graphic, it's labeling a mountable curb between the separated bike lane and the bike parking area. That means that a person biking can more easily get their bike into the bike parking area And this is going to become increasingly important as we think about heavier bikes, not just cargo bikes, but also electric bikes, that trying to lift them up a vertical curb is going to create a bigger challenge than providing things like mountable curbs that allow that transition to be a little more fluid. And then the last thing I'll touch on here is the guidance does have information about how many bike parking spaces is appropriate based on your facility type or your activity type. And I think what you'll find here matches the guidance in APBP's bike parking guidance. So with that, last thing I wanted to mention, AASHTO did give us a 10% discount code. So that is there on the slide. And I haven't been including it in the PDFs that I've sent to Dan to post on the website, but I forgot, so I did put it on there. So you don't need to take a screen capture of it. You'll be able to pull it off that slide. So Dan, what questions do we have in the chat?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, for
Oh
all that.
boy, what questions do we have, Dan?
Hannah, come on back. Charlotte, come on back. We're ready for some discussion. There were some really good questions that came in today that I think were, they built off of previous discussions we've had and kind of common themes. So I kind of want to tackle some of those big picture items first. And I think in general, and Hannah and I have been going back and forth on some of these, so maybe correcting the framing of the question, but a lot of questions come down to, I think, there seems to be an ideal condition and an ideal design for a lot of scenarios. And those are here in the guide. Yet we still see a lot of examples, both in the guide and in the real world, of we couldn't quite get the ideal in place. So we're going to have these mixing zone treatments in place of a protected intersection design. We're going to have an on-street standard bike lane in place of a separated bike lane because of context or constraint. So I wonder if you could just speak through, how the guide handles these, both the ideal condition and then the other options that are suitable. And then maybe we can have a bit of a group discussion about this because I think at the end of the day, it's what it comes down to, right? Is these various decisions that are context specific. We're not always building brand new roads, intersections from a blank slate. We have something existing to work with.
Yeah, I think that was something we were very deliberate in tackling with this guidance, that we wanted to be clear what are the facility widths and design elements that will truly meet the needs of what the guide what the guide's design user is, the interested but concerned user, while also dealing with the real world reality of different project types can do very different things, and that, yes, many of our projects are retrofit type installations where we're repurposing the curb to curb widths and there's a finite amount of space that's available to us. But also then making it clear when you're dipping below that bottom recommended range, and particularly if you're going all the way down to that practical minimum, that there are safety and comfort trade-offs associated with that. And so you might not get all the users using that facility that otherwise might if it were a higher comfort facility. I think, again, building off what we said in the first webinar, the linkage to other design guidance and design manuals is driving home this point that flexibility in design really needs to be considered, and sort of not defaulting to the biggest vehicular spaces and using what's left over for the other users, but trying to balance all the competing interests and needs. And so, that's something that I've certainly encountered in working with state DOTs and helping them to tackle some of these challenges. Is you need to be thinking about, well, can we go down to a 10-foot travel lane, particularly if we're doing it adjacent to a buffered bike lane? Like, you still have enough physical space to accommodate a bus and not having to worry about hitting mirrors and things like that. But there are, physical trade-offs associated with each inch that we reallocate in the street. And I feel like the guide tries to give you all the information that you need while also the flexibility that you need.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I'll just say that, we are still in the world of something is better than nothing. Like, yes, I would prefer to have fully separated bike facilities all across Minnesota. Every intersection is protected intersection. But I just, it's going to take some iterations to get there. And, we have to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so as we're trying to build out and complete this network of low stress facilities, it's like, yeah, some of the little pieces here and there are going to be a little bit higher stress, and I'm really sorry about that. But the alternative is to not build anything for bicyclists. Like, it's very easy for bikes to get squeezed out because we have ADA for pedestrian needs, and then the cars obviously articulate their needs constantly. And so you can end up with no bike facility, which obviously nobody wants. So I'm really encouraged to see how many questions we got about this. I was like, Jeremy, why are you showing an on-street bike lane through that interchange? That's ridiculous. It should be off-street. Yeah, we know, but it might end up on-street. And when it does, here's some advice for how to make it suck as little as possible, I guess. Like, it's not great, but it's better than nothing.
Yeah, and I think that the takeaway point being, the ideal condition, it's in the guidance, it's there, it's available, and push for that. That's maybe where the conversation starts a lot of times, and that condition wasn't always that great. Maybe in previous iterations there was we were starting further back. So it's a conversation. I know it's a stress point for many as well.
And there are still places where new roads are being developed, and so in those situations, this is now setting the stage for, okay, you really don't have the limitations. This is what should be implemented. And I've seen that firsthand. Like, I remember traveling around Texas in areas that were all new roads, all new development, and there were multi-lane roundabouts. And instead of providing at-grade crossings, there were underpasses, there were tunnels. It was very much like almost a Dutch style approach to dealing with path crossings at challenging locations. And now the design guidance reflects that, yeah, that's what we're striving for. And when the next capital improvement project comes through, that's when it's our opportunity to take that retrofit type design and further upgrade it. So everything will continue to grow depending on the type of project that we're implementing.
Well, I wonder too, this is a build on that discussion, but we're talking about maybe having to select a less than ideal treatment because of some kind of design consideration or context with that location. To what degree do you think that's the case versus maybe there's a bit of for something that feels newer or different or untested maybe in some folks' minds. They're not as engineers may not be as familiar with it, that there might be some trepidation about using that versus a design that maybe the agency has done before. They're more familiar with it, and they'd like to lean back maybe on that. And is there a learning curve there to getting engineers and designers maybe used to some of these newer items in the toolbox?
I know that there is a learning curve, and we discussed in the first webinar why the release of this guide took so long, that we were going through multiple rounds of comments with the state DOT officials and those who had the opportunity to comment on this document. And part of the vein of some of the comments that we were receiving was part of that. I'm not familiar with that facility type and some trepidation with including that. But the fact that it did go through balloting, it did have full support from the states, and now is published as the AASHTO Bike Guide. AASHTO is that conglomerate of state DOTs that says this is our recommended best practice. So I think just the inclusion of all of this content in the bike guide now gives us that flexibility in those discussions to say, well, here's what the guidance says, and here's what's recommended, and here's what's allowed, and let's talk about what we can actually achieve in this project.
Yeah.
But if it wasn't in there, then I think it would be a lot harder to have those discussions. There will be a learning curve of becoming familiar with everything that's in here, but I'm already starting to see that in discussions with DOTs that I hadn't worked with before. They're already starting to cite well, the AASHTO bike guide just came out and it says this. I'm like, yeah, well, I'm aware.
Yeah. Yeah, it carries some weight, right? I think that's a good point. I got distracted by a bike parking question, so I want to ask you that, shifting gears a little bit. Can we reasonably put bike parking in an intersection bump out curb extension space? What are the visibility concerns you might see, sight distance issues that might come up with that, or is that a fine idea? I wonder what the guide says about that and what the perspective of the panel is on something like bike
I
parking in a
mean,
bump out.
bike parking corrals are things that particularly urbanized areas have been doing for more than a decade now. Replacing a vehicular parking space with on-street bike corrals that can hold,
Mhm.
10, a dozen parked bicycles. I've not seen that be an issue of sight lines, particularly as bicycles don't take up a lot of space and um, I've also seen, and the guidance does speak to this as well. I didn't touch on the um, shared bike share citing, but that also talks about the placement of some of those features within the street. That said, certainly working with some state DOTs, I've had pushback and that at the DO on the state roads, they don't always want to place some of these features within the roadway, but on the adjacent local streets, that's not an issue. So it's certainly worth having that discussion, and perhaps different agencies will have slightly different approaches on what they will allow depending on who owns and maintains the roadway. Um, but yeah, it's certainly an option, and the fact that it's been implemented for more than a decade in many places with no issues that I'm aware of, sort of reinforces that that's a viable option.
They're definitely less opaque than signal cabinets. And I don't know about other states, but Minnesota's signal cabinets keep getting bigger and taller and wider all the time. So, there's sight distance at intersections is important, but there's a lot of competing needs for that space. So
Yeah, great point. You spoke, Jeremy, a little bit about bicyclist detection at intersections and laying out some really good options there. There were some questions about, one just came in fact, using advanced detection at trail crossings for things like an RRFB or a pedestrian hybrid beacon. To kind of maximize that activation in advance of the bicyclist arrival at the crossing. Could you speak about that? Is that anywhere in the guide, or are there recommended practices for such a thing?
So we did show detection on the approach to signalized intersections, and part of that is just to let the signal know that there is a bicyclist that's approaching, and if you were, you know, gonna activate the signal and have like different red or green clearance times based on the presence of a
Mhm.
bicyclist, that gives you some of that flexibility, or to give that heads up that there is a bicyclist approaching. In terms of on a shared use path, I'm not aware. Well, first, I don't remember us including suggestions for that in the guide, and I would have some hesitation of doing that. Part of it relates to um, you're going to encounter different conditions, and you might have bicyclists on a shared use path that aren't going to actually cross the street, that instead they're going to turn right or left, or um, not actually cross. So it could be giving an incorrect indication to motorists. It's also then going to activate the RRFB before the bicyclist might even be visible to the approaching motorist. You'll recall when we discussed the content of chapter 5 that we did discuss sight lines for shared use paths, and this recognition that there are times where stop control versus yield control for that shared use path might be appropriate. But if we don't have lines of sight and are triggering an RRFB, even though that user isn't present, that may diminish the effectiveness of the RRFB. So maybe there are some unique situations where that might be relevant. Certainly, if it was a PHB or something like that, maybe giving that heads up that this is about to be triggered could have some benefit. but I'd sort of take that on a case-by-case basis.
See. Charlotte or Hannah, any follow-up on that question that you had?
No.
Okay.
No, good
Okay.
job, Jeremy.
This one came in a couple of times, and I think it actually came in previous episodes as well. There's some questions about guardrail and whether the sort of recommended practice for placement of guardrail between the bicyclist path and the travel lane, or if guardrail is always located outside of the bicyclist pathway. And I think it's a useful time to discuss, because a lot of times decisions are made about guardrail, and they don't always make sense for who they're protecting and what they're protecting motorists from, and hazards in the roadside, things like that. So, and I don't know if that's covered in detail in this guide versus other guidance from AASHTO. But could you speak a bit about what's typical practice when it comes to placing guardrail and where the bicyclist facility is typically located?
I can tell
So,
you, I'm gonna give you the MnDOT answer, and then I'm gonna see what Jeremy has to say.
Okay.
So the MnDOT answer is that guardrail is not designed to protect the thing that is behind the guardrail. It is designed to protect the thing that is in front of the guardrail. So, all of the MASH testing for guardrail is based on the safety of the occupant of the vehicle, and the shrapnel and everything behind it is just like not even a consideration. So it seems like walking or biking behind the guardrail would be safer for you. We don't know that that's the case, and in fact, it might actually be the opposite. So we route everything in front of the guardrail wherever possible in Minnesota.
in the structures chapter, we discuss, if I'm remembering this all correctly, um, discuss that where you need crashworthy barrier on a bridge, that ideally that crashworthy barrier would be placed between the bicycle, the shared use path, or whatever the bicycle facility is, and the adjacent roadway. But that would be a rigid barrier, not guardrail or guide rail, depending on what state you're in. And so that would be beneficial because that is providing rigid protection between the motorized and the non-motorized users. Um, I'm aware of a few situations where shared use paths have been installed behind metal guide rail. The challenges associated with that are that you now have um, exposed posts adjacent to a shared use path. So if you were considering that, you would need some separation from those posts because they are sharp, and if struck would be also dangerous. So the shy distance guidance would apply in that situation. And to what Hannah said, you know, guardrail is intended to deflect. And so if struck and if people are present there, those people would be in the way of those posts. But I do not I do not recall the AASHTO bike guide speaking about metal guardrail and its proximity to bike facilities behind the facility.
The
But
question just came in.
does that
Oh,
come
yeah,
up a lot
please. Yeah.
in Washington? Do you deal with guardrail a lot in Washington, Charlotte?
We do, and we have several instances where the shared use path is behind the guardrail, and in some cases we put it on the other side. Um, just don't we don't at this time have a definitive on where that's going to fall.
Couple of questions about one advisory bike lanes. That was a popular topic, both the advisory bike lanes and advisory shoulders. And when you were talking about the advisory bike lanes, there was a question about what is that width for the motor vehicle, that two-way motor vehicle lane, assuming a advisory bike lane on both sides of the street, that center space. Is there a recommended range there?
Yeah, and that's where I was saying that it differs, that there's sort of two different configurations. So one is between 10 and 13 and a half. So that's where only one vehicle can physically fit between the advisory bike lanes. And then 16 to 18 feet was that range where two passenger sized vehicles can largely fit within that space, though you would expect that there's going to be some encroachment. What the guide speaks to is that you should try to avoid providing a central travel lane width between 13.5 and 16, because that's that weird area where it's not visually evident to the driver if there's enough space for one or two vehicles. And so, essentially, if you were in that situation, you would try to reduce that width and repurpose the space to the advisory bike lanes. It's still going to be the same amount of pavement, edge of pavement to edge of pavement width. It's just how you're visually depicting it.
I see. A question about right turn on red signs. There's obviously some concern about the potential for a motorist turning right across, say, a separated bike lane or a cycle track design. And so this person is just asking, what's the latest and best practice for signing right turn on red restriction? Obviously, there's a standard sign. Their sense is that motorists either routinely, intentionally, or non-intentionally ignore them and just turn right anyway. Any good recommended practices for reinforcing that law and ensuring driver compliance?
Yeah, I know Bill Schulteis and Mario Coleman recently gave a webinar on no turn on red, and its sort of historic legacy that has been really challenging when it comes to active transportation safety. The guide speaks to the fact that if we have bicycle signals, that in those situations we need to provide protected phasing for bicyclists that are proceeding. So that does rely on a need for no turn on red. Um, the guide also discusses that yes, you can use static signs, but you also have the flexibility to use dynamic signs. So no turn on red signs that are activated when it's most important. So when bikes and peds have their leading interval and situations where you really just don't want the motor vehicle making that maneuver while also being able to eke out, a few extra turns per hour by turning that sign off during the parts of the signal phase where we don't have active transportation conflicts. That is something that we've implemented on projects. I know it's implemented in a number of cities across the US, but I think there's also a component of this that allowing turns on red has been such a long-standing thing that it's going to require um, some enforcement and some time and sort of a larger policy discussion about, are we going to allow this as a normal treatment, or are we going to revert back to prohibiting turns on red except for specific situations? And I think that will be a longer discussion and something that we'll probably see throughout the rest of our careers.
Mm.
You touched on, apologies if I missed this, Jeremy, but work zones are a pretty hot topic. Temporary traffic control areas, pretty hot topic for folks in the webinar. And I'm wondering if you have any recommendations for simply kind of engaging with those who are involved in temporary traffic control and setting up work zones and making sure that some of these recommendations get into that queue. I mean, I think it's one thing to talk about engaging with your state design engineers and local design engineers, but often those work zones, that they seem to be a different animal in a lot of places. And I wonder if you have tips for, engaging to properly ensure a bicyclist's safe travel through such an environment, I guess, that can be fairly unpredictable.
Yeah, so we do provide guidance on bicycle signing and detours in the wayfinding chapter.
Okay.
I didn't show any graphics of it. My recollection of what the text speaks to is this reinforcement that when we're designing work zones, we need to be considering who the bicycle design user was for that facility. And this recognition that if we're saying that this is a street that accommodates the needs of people of all ages and abilities, if the work zone design does not accommodate that, then that is a problem. That it essentially means the bicyclist needs to do something that they really aren't comfortable doing, or that creates some safety challenges. Or more importantly, it should mean that through the vetting process of what maintenance and protection of traffic will be allowed here, that we're not going to skimp on the accommodation for the bicyclist, that we are going to maintain that if it's a separated facility, we're going to maintain a separated facility that meets that same level of comfort to meet those needs, or we are going to sign a detour route that does meet that continued level of comfort.
Thank you for that. And I'm sorry to say that we don't have any more time for questions today, but I do want to mention that we will be hosting these deep dive sessions to follow. They aren't scheduled yet. We don't know the topic yet, and we're hoping you all can help us determine those. I dropped a link just now to a post-webinar questionnaire in the chat. If you take a look at that, provide some responses based on today's webinar, but also big picture. If you have an idea of something you think we should take a deeper dive into, let us know there. Email us too. This link will be coming to you if you didn't grab it just now. It'll come to you in email form as well. So you'll have an opportunity. Fill that out. That's how you get your certificate of attendance for the webinar as well. I just wanted to say one final thank you to Jeremy, to Hannah, to Charlotte for joining us for all 3 episodes and more to come. And so we appreciate all the work you all have put into this important guide and taking time with us to share the specifics and details. So thanks to you all for joining us. Thanks to our panelists, and hopefully we'll see you again soon in a follow-up session.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.